Hello, my name is Scott Williams, and I serve as the pastor of Memorial Presbyterian Church in Roosevelt, Long Island. A recent U.S. News and World Report identified Nassau County as the safest county in America. They used several indicators to arrive at this conclusion. And while many residents may be proud that the region in which they live has received this recognition, this isn't the narrative other Nassau County dwellers would tell. Some say that this is a tale of two counties. In communities like Hempstead, Freeport, and Roosevelt, neighborhoods largely populated by Black and brown people, residents will label this study as misleading. They say that those called to protect and serve deal with them differently than their white counterparts. During this discussion, we plan to open the dialogue about law enforcement's relationship with communities of color and hopefully arrive at some suggestions on how we can move forward. On our panel today, we have Paul Johnson, the Chief of Police for Hempstead Police Department. We have Thomas Higdon joining us by Zoom. He's a retired New York Police Department Deputy Inspector. We have Bernard Robinson, the Director of Operations for Northwell Center for Emergency Medical Services. And we have Andre Vanterpool, a social worker, coach, community leader, and Nassau County resident. Gentlemen, I'm so glad to have all of you here joining in this discussion, and I'm going to ask the first question: is the relationship between law enforcement and community members strained, or is this a figment of either group's imaginations? Anybody want to share?
Well, I'll go first. I think the relationship between law enforcement and the community is generally good. There's certain things that happened during the past year, certain national incidents which kind of led to an uprising. And I think, some people perceive that as being the norm everywhere when it's not. If an incident happens in, say, Wisconsin or Minneapolis or something, that doesn't mean it's happening in New York, but yet there are protests in New York. So it just seems like everybody wants like a national forum on policing and, how do we make our police departments better? But I think generally the police department and the community get along very well.
And that includes communities of color?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else want to share?
I think that it's shifted in certain ways that I know growing up that certain programs such as the PAL and other forms that where police were a part of the community, we talk about the beat cop and things of that nature. I know that officers were familiar with the residents, and I see throughout the years with whether it was defunding. I know in Manhasset there was closing of the 6th precinct, so that left the responsibility of, I believe it was the 3rd precinct, to cover that area. But now the residents aren't familiar. There isn't funding for any officers to be there on a regular basis to build rapport. So now it's strangers dealing with strangers on a regular basis. So now there's a different experience, there's a different climate. And oftentimes, I talk about building a relationship or bond. Most of the time when there's interaction with the police, it's about a dispute or something that's going on. It's not a friendly visit. So there have been less opportunities to just have a healthy conversation, whether it be about law, whether it be about how to best handle things in the community. Those forums are usually left to like town hall meetings or some type of forum of that nature, and it's not as organic as it used to be, just because of whether it be funding or just the times changing.
Mr. Vanderpool, what do you mean by stranger versus stranger?
Well, I'll just use Chief Johnson. If Chief Johnson came to my neighborhood to address an issue that happened, it's the first time meeting him, then there was another issue and he didn't return. It wasn't his time. Someone else in the department came. The next time I saw him was maybe 2-3 months later. as opposed to I remember seeing the same police officers
Gotcha.
on a regular basis, whether patrolling the neighborhood, because they were right there. And there was times to have conversation just because they were there. And I'm not saying that it speaks of all communities, but I know that is an issue in some places.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think community policing was, is really integral in having a good relationship and knowing the officers and knowing the community. And that's something that, obviously I think that the departments are strained and they're not able to do that as much as they, were in the past. But I grew up in Brooklyn, and actually we knew the officers in our neighborhood because that, we were fortunate to have that kind of a program. But, I also have friends that didn't grow up, with that kind of relationship with law enforcement, So that was definitely, having that relationship is definitely key.
Okay. Inspector, how do you feel?
You asked the question, is the relationship between law enforcement and community members strained, or is this a figment of either group's imagination? I think it depends on the group that you're talking to. I mean, you can go into, well, I had the privilege of work. I started off my career, I was born and raised in Best. I lived in the Marshall Project as a kid. So when I joined the department, I was living in Queens, and it was 103, 113 area. So when I first joined the department, I was working in, I think it was called Garrison. It was over by King's Plaza in Brooklyn. I forget what you call that area. Yeah. But anyway, that was a predominantly white area. I stayed there for approximately 10 months when they realized they must have made a mistake. And they sent me to the 73rd precinct, which was in Brownsville. And I will tell you now that the relationship in the 63rd precinct was predominantly white, and the 73rd precinct was completely two different places from perspective. Because you go into, I don't know, like I said, I don't know, I'm probably much older than the rest of you guys. Look at the policing for us. The 6-3 was entirely different from the policing in the 7-3. There was a lot more leniency in the 63rd precinct than it was in the 73rd precinct. So in the 7-3, people were getting locked up like crazy. If they was walking around with uncovered beer, for example, or if they was, and at that time, drugs was kind of heavy. So there was a big difference in policing in the 6-3. So if you say they're strained, I would say absolutely so, depending on the community living and where you're coming from.
What would you say contributes to a community's feeling or community members feeling uncomfortable with police or law enforcement?
One of my biggest problems in the department was like you bring in people from the outside, so they come from Nassau County, as a matter of fact. Maybe they come from Nassau or Suffolk County and they come into the city and they have their preconceived notions when they get there. So they're not really used to how we live in our community. For me, it was a comfort for me going back to the 73rd precinct. And the 6-3, it was an environment when I would go to a job and the guy actually said in my face, he wanted a white officer to take the report from him. So that was, like I said, that was in the 70s. So when we talk about that, and in the 73, okay, you had a little different approach, because some of the brothers referred to you as Uncle Tom and different things like that. But because of the reputation, me being from the Brooklyn, understanding what they experienced, from me experiencing the same thing coming up, I never closed my eyes. I always realized who I was and how I was raised up. So I think that's one of the problems. I think people forget where they came from. The majority of people that's going through, everybody is not as privileged as maybe some of us are on this phone, on this Zoom. But I think that's one of the main problems. I think people come from the outside, and if they come with their preconceived notions of who we are as a people, they seem to spill over there when they propose the way they function. I'm not saying all. I didn't say all. But a lot of too many. I would say that to you. Many of them. That's how they propose.
That's a good point.
It's an interesting point that you raised, because we were speaking before about some preconceived notions that communities of color are high crime areas. And does that, or fear or distrust, does that contribute to the feelings of uncomfortability between community members and police and community members. What do you gentlemen think?
So I think that when we grow up in our neighborhoods, in our silos, right? So if I grew up in Long Island in Nassau County, that's my silo, that's where I grew up. If I grew up in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, which I did, that was my silo. I don't interact with anyone else outside of that silo until I become an adult and I get a job. Now you place me in a police car or an ambulance in the front seat with somebody from an entirely different neighborhood and put me in a neighborhood I'm not familiar with, things are gonna come out and I'm gonna feel uncomfortable, I'm gonna be uneasy, and that's kind of what we see sometimes. I'll give you an example. I've had, in my supervisor days, I would get called because I had a crew who did not want to get out of the vehicle because there were a bunch of people in front of the building listening to music and playing dice. That's called the projects. That's in the summer. Like that, you know, if it was a different crew, it'd have been no problem. I worked in Brooklyn in my early days and, you know, I'm familiar with that. It's not a big deal to me, but, you know, preconceived notions. And the quote I got was, there's a lot of them out there. What am I supposed to do?
Wow.
Like, go take care of the call that you were sent to. But these preconceived notions, I grew up in, you know, this person grew up in whatever town. This is one of their first interactions and they were petrified. You know, this is what is a real thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. D.I. Higdon spoke about it. About being in Gerritsen Beach in Brooklyn and having to deal with what many people deal with on a daily basis. Only the flip side, he was the officer and the community members were white. Mr. Vanterpool, you live in Manhasset, and which is, I'd say, predominantly European community. How do the law enforcement deal with you or anecdotally anyone you know that look like you?
Well, it used to be more direct or personal, but now it comes through forums and, you know, community. It's not as personal as it used to be. And I understand that living in a certain area, you don't necessarily have to deal with minorities. It's not your way of everyday living. So a place like Plandome Road has everything that you would need from, if you start from the end of Plandome Road in Northern Boulevard, you have the gas station, you have the church, you have the pizzeria, you have the printing press, you have the grocery stores, you have the Long Island Railroad, you have Bank of America, Chase, movie theaters, everything is right there on that road. If there's no minorities that really work in those areas. So anything that you would need, car, clothing, food, you don't have to deal with minorities on a regular basis to understand how they're living. I'm someone who went to Manhasset High School, and I can say that none of my friends who are outside of the minority group have ever been to my house to see where I lived and how I was living. So there's a choice of having to understand or not. So I understood that they may not understand because they don't have to. In order for me to live and function in the world, I have to go to these places to operate. So in dealing with the police, it's easy to just take the stories as well as the residents. I know my friends, whether you're listening to music, whether you're dealing with the friends who've had encounters, the stereotypes of not talking to the police or what they're going to do. We have some of these stereotypes about the doctors, about our parents not going to the stereotypes are heavy, and there are limited opportunities to kind of learn what's against those type of things, because I learned a lot more about diversity and relationships when I was able to go to college and had a consistent interaction with different minorities, or they made it a count to bring the police and the chief of police to talk to the players, and we built a rapport. So it changed my perspective of also learning about the law as well. So
I remember in a previous conversation you mentioning us getting how we feel about law enforcement almost like anecdotally from someone else's experience. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I know when I had having an outside conversation with Chief Johnson just about, you know, the amazing work that he was doing and feeling like some things he just won't get credit for because, like he mentioned before, if there are changes that are happening within the town of Hempstead and then something happens in Philadelphia, you know, it triggers us as a people and we take it out on the officers as a whole, and we kind of perpetuate the same behaviors that we don't want ourselves, where if I do something as a black man in America, I don't represent all black people as a whole. And we don't want that to happen, or like we're selective with that. So now, does the chief represent all officers, or should we focus on what he's doing in the town, in his area, the relationship he's built, and continue to give credit where it's due, despite what's happening in other communities that I don't currently live in? Like I don't want to take away or deter or, you know, devalue anything that the chief is doing because of what happened in another state. I don't think that's fair at all.
Okay. All right. I don't know if Inspector Higdon wants to share or Chief Johnson. Would you like to share on that?
You know, a lot of the things being said here, we're talking about black and white, and I don't always look at everything as being black and white. Sometimes it could be rich and poor. You know, many of the minority communities, or you have impoverished people, you know, there's many poor people there. And many of them are more densely populated. So there's a difference right there. If you're going into Hempstead and you see somebody with an open container of beer, well, you're probably not just going to see one, you're probably going to see a bunch, because there's a whole lot of people out there. And you're dealing with people who don't have money, and some of them have health issues, mental health issues, and that sort of stuff. Now, if you go across the border somewhere in Garden City, you know, where people have money, they're more wealthy, they're not as densely populated, there's a big difference there. So I don't think it's necessarily black and white. It's just, you know, your status in society, whether, you know, you're wealthy or you're poor. And I think that's part of the problem. And I think people tend to overlook at that. They just look at everything as black and white, and it's not always black and white. You've heard people always make comments about trailer park trash or something. Well, why do you say that? Because they're not wealthy, but yet, you know, some of those same communities are not people of color. You know, they're largely white communities, and you know, they have some of the same problems that are going on in the black and brown communities. So I think it's more of an issue of your economic status. Yes.
How do you feel, Inspector? How do you feel about that?
I've listened to the chief said, and I understand. I don't live in Hempstead, so, and I heard what the other young man said, how the chief establishes himself over there. But I would suggest to you that it's just a multitude of things that come into that the whole picture. You say, well, there's maybe money, maybe healthcare, a number of different reasons why depression and oppression exists. So for me, when I know, I can tell you when I had the 2-8, like I said, for approximately 6 years, and I love being up there. But I can tell you, before I left, the community changed. The yuppies started moving into Holland. So now policing changed. There's no doubt about it. Policing changed. Because when we were, before, it was a bit of a numbers game. When we had our community affairs meetings, I don't know if the chief probably does that in Hempstead, I don't know. But we had our community affairs meetings, so we were held accountable in the community. So so the whole complexion of the community council changed. So the demands became different. So you're not going to use, I'll use an example of this. Going back when we had the Central Park, those kids in Central Park, and they got locked up for allegedly raping the lady in Central Park. And they just treated them like animals. I can remember that so clearly. I think I was a sergeant or something at the time. I can remember talking against that. I said, the kids didn't do it, blah, 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 blah. But yet there was an incident in Brooklyn at the same time. They chased the kid. I think his name was Yusef Parker, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if anybody else remembers that.
Yes,
but
yes.
Yusef from across Belt Parkway, they killed him. And they said they told the kids in Central Park was a bunch of animals, there was a bunch of this, there was a bunch of that. And the present president, he put out a long page article making reference to that. And the ones in Brooklyn, oh, they was just acting out. I don't even think anybody got locked up, if I'm not mistaken. And they killed the kid. So it's policing different, because our community is different, the man's different, of course they're different. I mean, if you walk around with your eyes wide open, you know that police different in white communities than they do in black communities. And I've been saying that when I was in the department, that's probably why I didn't get more high inspector. But anyway, I was telling them that since I've been in the job, because it is what it is. And I don't look at everything black and white either, because I have some white officers that I will say that probably was better than a whole lot of those black ones, but some of them black ones kept in the department and started acting like white ones. So I had a problem with that also. So yes, there is a difference. There's a huge difference, and I get really uptight with that, because now when I look and see what's going on in our community throughout, I'm not talking about them today, because I don't know what chief does out there. Believe me, I'm not trying to disrespect anything. However, when I look around the state and see what's going on, all it takes is one. That's the one that's making the newspaper. All it takes is one. One guy kneeling on somebody's neck until he dies. One idiot. And if he gets away with it, then like the chief said, it's only one guy. But that's the guy that sells the newspaper. They don't see what chief is doing to himself. They only see that one guy. And that's what sells newspapers. And that's one of the problems.
Absolutely.
All percentage of the department, but that percentage is the one the public see.
Absolutely. And just on a side note, I know the great work that the Hempstead Police Department does, and rarely do we see that information broadcast on any of the news media. But they do great work, and I don't quite understand it. But I want to get back to the statement that you both have made. Is not a black and white thing, but we have to clearly agree that there is a disproportionate number of people of color who have expressed negative engagement with law enforcement. And it often happens in communities of color. I'd like to know, what role does the law enforcement play in making it better, and what role does the community member play in making it better? Mr. Vanterpool.
The community definitely, I think it starts with the inner work. My expectations aren't always high for the outside to treat us a certain way if we're not showing that same behaviors. It's often that we talk about the other side, about the officers, but how we do ourselves. I think defining what community means now is really a huge thing. I think that we use that word very loosely without a clear understanding of what that means. You know, I can speak a little bit for the younger generation, and being a part of my community and not seeing the same fight pillars and drive for the immediate community as it used to be. Saying that there were several board members, there were several people in the community out fighting. We had resources at the local hospitals and police departments and other agencies, and the current generation hasn't. I'm not saying as a whole, I'm just gonna speak for the area. It's like there's less physical aspects. So meaning that I had someone in my community who represented the community leader. So when the police came into the community, they often talked to that community leader who could relay the message to the community. And then there were other people who work within the community to spread that word or bring things together. It's not as present as it used to be. A lot of people focus more on the social media or digital aspect of being a leader as opposed to physically being out there. And we don't really talk about appointing who's going to be that leader or person, or even passing those things down, having these conversations. Because if things are passed down from generation to generation, then a forum, not only a forum such as this, but just regular everyday conversations where the community members and gentlemen are coming together to discuss what can be done, should be a regular thing. It shouldn't have to do with funding. It shouldn't have to do with it should happen whether the things are going well or things are going poorly. It should be a regular practice. So I think that focusing on ourselves and changing our behaviors and showing what should be done as an example to the police. Like, we're going to handle these things. These are the things we want you to do, not just you handle it all and we're going to wait for you to change the things around us. I think that defining, as a, analogy, too many chiefs and not enough Indians. It's like we have to come
No
together.
offense, Chief.
Yeah. But just I think defining certain things is going to help us be clearer moving forward.
I remember you sharing about developing a dialogue. You shared this a few meetings ago about us developing a dialogue, the community and the police, and then, of course, elected officials sitting around a table and just talking so that we could hear each other's hearts and understand where we are and then figure out concrete ways of moving forward.
Oh, most definitely. I think that these are things that I wish for my whole life, of talking with gentlemen of older generations to kind of pass on how things would be to help with the generations to come, because I think it's passing the baton. I think that the younger generations, we have access to a lot more things now. There's a lot of questions, and I think that the older generation has a lot of the answers, but it hasn't always been the practice to share the information. Coming from a different time, there's a lot of experiences that we need to do in order to move forward. So these things, just as a people, and especially people of color, and as men, especially, if I could say that, it's a must in order for any of these things to happen and for change to happen.
Chief, you spoke before about not the public not understanding what the role of the police. This is a former meeting. The public not understanding the role of the police, and maybe the police not understanding exactly where the public are. Does that cause a problem in policing, effectively policing a community?
It's difficult to answer, but what I'll say, maybe going back to a little bit to what your previous topic was, when you said people of color having negative opinions about police in their neighborhood. Again, I go back to not so much black and white, but the wealth of the community. Mm-hmm. So if you have certain communities where there's substance abuse problems, mental health, healthcare, and that sort of stuff, mm-hmm. a more congested community, mm-hmm. Where there's more crime, how do you deal with the crime and quality of life? Mm-hmm. Traditionally, what you do is you send more police into that community and you do more enforcement, sometimes heavy-handed enforcement, trying to get things under control. Mm-hmm. That means the people in that community are going to have more interactions with the police.
Right.
They're going to be getting more tickets, there's going to be more arrests and that sort of stuff. And I think that leads up to them having negative experience with the cops. When you start saying the police always around, they're harassing us, and but at the same time, you have a certain aspect of that same community asking for those police to be there. They want the shootings to stop. They want the robberies to stop. Mm-hmm. They want a better quality of life. They don't want the drug dealers in front of their homes. So there's more and more police there, and then there's just more and more negative interactions. And that sort of leads that community to feel, the police are abusing them or they're being mistreated and that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to do heavy-handed enforcement and to bring things under control unless you have an interaction with people, and that just leads to their bad perceptions of the police.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Robinson, you have two you're raising two young black men. Mm-hmm. How is it you're sharing with them, or what are you sharing with them about their engagements or how to engage the police?
Okay, so with my sons, I definitely had the talk with them, right? Mm-hmm. You definitely, how to interact with the police, what to do, how to say, your movements, your demeanor, we all have that talk. But I do believe that with the relationship, it's about respect, and it's about character, right? You have to respect each other. You have to respect yourselves, your own community, but also extend that respect to the other side. And I'll give you a story. a few years ago, about 10 years ago, I was a medic, and I'm in a deli in Queens trying to get some breakfast. The previous night, there was an officer that got killed in the line of duty. And you know, in these delis, they have all the newspapers laid out, and a young guy walks in, probably in his 20s, with his little, I guess maybe his son or nephew, whatever, little boy about 3 or 4. He sees the headline, and he starts celebrating. Oh, good, I'm glad that happened, in front of this little child. Now that child now is probably 17, you know, whatever. He grew up, this is a person he looks up to, and this is what he is feeding into this child. So it's just that cycle that, you know, it keeps going on. But on the other side, fast forward to today, we had Breonna Taylor, we had Ahmaud Arbery, we had George Floyd. And because of social media, now we see that there are people in law enforcement that have those kind of sentiments towards when a black person is victimized or the same thing. So one, that's character. That's a character issue, and social media kind of fume that on both sides. Where I don't want to say it's out of control, but it's definitely the span.
Yeah.
You can, if you have to write a Twitter account, you can reach 1 million people in a second. So that doesn't help to make things easier. But we will have to check. Everybody needs to check their side and check themselves and watch what they're spreading. But you know, that's just kind of where I stand on that.
I find it interesting. We in a conversation the 4 of us had with another colleague who is European. She shared with us that in her community, they don't necessarily have to have the talk you were speaking about. Inspector Higdon, why do you think we as black men need to have that talk with the young black boys mostly, but also the young black girls we're raising?
I think that the whole thing is a reality, which you're saying, that we do try to educate our kids as much as we can in reference to some of these incidents that we talked about. Because it's real. You know, I'm afraid for my grandkids. I have about 6 grandsons and 6 or 7 grandsons, and 3 of them now are 18 over. You know, one just started college and one just got out. Another one is there also. And when I think about that, and you know, the reality of it, you have to educate them because you don't want them to do anything silly and it cause them to lose their lives. And that's the way we're living today. Because, like I said, it's coming from up high. So when you see that coming from the extent that it's coming from, and it spreads out in the different states. Because unfortunately, we don't have a chief in every location. That's the problem. The good work that he's doing, you don't read about that because it doesn't sell newspapers.
Right.
But the bad that come up, that's what the problem is. So yes, I would definitely educate my kids, and I think if you don't, you better educate them.
I have to say that Inspector Higdon has educated a number of people and many churches. He's shared a lot of information with civic groups about how to have that talk. And if we have to have that talk, then there must be a reason we are having that talk with our young black kids. But I want to ask you, gentlemen, a question. Do we see any hope for a change in the relationships that are strained between police and community? I understand that, Chief, you say that there is a good relationship between police and community in Hempstead, but there are many. We must admit there are many communities that the relationship is a little shakier. How do we see any hope for change? Can we replicate what's happening in Hempstead in other places, and how do we do that?
Yes, I think there are many police departments that do a lot of community engagement. They have activities. They're out there. They're interacting with the youth out there. They're getting out there, they're meeting the local clergy people, local civic association presidents and stuff like that, and they work with them, and I think it kind of spreads out to the community when they see there's officers out there doing a lot of good work.
Great. I agree with you. How about community policing? where is that? In terms of funding, where is that?
Well, and my department, it's good. We've just added, at first we added 6 people to our community policing unit. I think last week we added 2 more. And there's probably a couple more going in there. We just awarded $1 million grant through from a federal grant we got. And part of that grant has the hiring of 3 additional officers, which will also be community policing officers for my department. But we are putting more officers in community policing. We have them out there going to the civic associations and meeting people and finding out what their problems are in the community. The officers are each signed an area, so they're the civic associations, the locals, they're dealing with just those officers. So it works.
I agree. Mr. Robinson shared about how it works in Brooklyn. Mr. Vanderpool shared about how it works in Manhasset. Community policing is one concrete way that we can better the relationship between community members and law enforcement. What other concrete steps can we take to better this relationship? Anybody? Anybody?
I think internal discussions amongst both sides, figure out what the problem is among their own community. What's the issue? What are the issues that are, causing this animosity, and discuss that. Mm-hmm. And also, obviously on the law enforcement side, the same thing. What are the issues? Mm-hmm. Listen, I'm not going to paint one community because of, a few people. I'm not going to paint an entire department by any means because of one of few incidents. But when you do have it, on CNN, on Fox, as soon as you put the news on, the first stories you see or the first 4 stories usually crime. That helps to paint the narrative. So sometimes we have to kind of be cognizant of that and not let that consume your mind because that's all you see.
Yeah, you have to realize what he said is exactly right because you have 2 sides that are basically stereotyping each other. Mm-hmm. One thing happens nationally and then people look at all police as that one incident when it's not true.
Absolutely.
Then maybe you have some crimes and things that happen in the minority community and then there may be some officers who stereotype all people of color as being representative of that community and they look at them in the same way as that person who commit the crime. So it seems like there's a little bit of stereotyping on both sides.
I love that. I love what you're saying, but how do we change the narrative? I agree with you. How do we change that narrative, though? What are some concrete ways?
I think we have to be conscious of what we're saying. So not sharing I think that in all aspects, if you want to go black and white, if you want to go police and communities, I think that a big part of the stereotype is feeling like it has to be this whole uniform thing with everyone. Some of it could be just eradicated just by being silent. Now, meaning that if I had something negative to say about the police and I shared it with you, and then you shared it with Mr. Robinson, and then he just said, you know what, I'm not gonna spread that story anymore. Right. I'm just gonna keep it to myself or just not, I'm gonna allow, so now by passing that story on, you're not passing that story on to your grandchildren who will now take on those traumas and experiences with them to now approach Chief Johnson with those wrongful sentiment stereotypes. You allow them to create their own stories. So now, instead of me having to tell this young man to not believe or what was going on, he's entering it with a clear mind, a first-time experience of Chief Johnson to experience it for himself. This happens with people, you talk about Europeans. I can say many of them who've helped me get to where I am to not categorize all. Mm-hmm. So I can say that there are blacks who treated me worse than Europeans, and I can say vice versa. So if I choose to not spread, right, it would be similar to wearing your mask. So if you have that same negative sentiment or your negative aspects or things that you want to say, just put your mask on those negative comments, those negative thoughts. It's the same concept. That alone would stop spreading of these negative things. So that's an action that can be done.
That's great. So, not spreading negativity, community policing, not painting everybody with a broad brush. Anything, Inspector?
You know, one of the things that we had in the department, I don't know if Chief, I don't know what year Chief was, I think he said he was in the 115, I don't know what year he was there, but years ago we used to have, I don't know, Chief, do you remember when we used to have sensitivity programs?
Yes.
And so when they had the sensitivity program, they brought people people from the community in at roll call. Now the cops didn't like that, did they, Chief?
No,
They didn't like that at all. A lot of cops, they hated that. They didn't want anything to do with that. But it was good because they got to taste how the community felt, and the community felt empowered by coming into the roll call and talking to them. So I think sometimes, like, I used to stand there, as a CEO, I'll stand right there in roll call when we introduced for example, Reverend Sharpton wasn't around until, he didn't really come into too many precincts until I got up to office. Because part of 125th Street was part of my area, and I happened to know Rev before I became the CEO up there. So when I took over the 2-8, right naturally, the cops, they hated that. Oh man, this CEO, man, that guy, he's a radical, he's this, he's that. He's over there in Reverend Sharpton's office. And so I went over to Reverend Sharpton's office. I went to Congressman Charlie Randall's office. I went to everybody's office in there. And Chief knows what I'm talking about. I met all the movers and shakers. But the one that they hated me to go over to was Reverend Sharpton. So I wanted Reverend Sharpton to talk to roll call. Because they didn't bring him in and preach, oh man, we hate him. That guy, man, that CEO, he's a racist. But this is what we got to deal with. Let the man talk. You don't even know him. All you do is read about what you read in the newspaper. Now, maybe some people there sitting in front of you have misconceptions about him. But I will tell you this. Everything that he ever responded to, somebody called him. So my point is that I think those sensitivity meetings, I don't know how Chief felt about it. Even though the cops hated him, I think it was a good thing. I think it was an excellent thing.
I'm not sure what I'm looking at. I will say, well, so you're saying sensitivity, not training, but getting, providing venues or opportunities where police and community could engage one another so that they can hear where each other are. Is that what you're saying?
Sensitivity training. For example, you as being a pastor, you could come sit and Chief would introduce you out in Hempstead, and he would bring you into his roll call where he had the police officers have the 10, 15-minute briefings or whatever we're doing, and he would bring and introduce you, and you would have an opportunity just to talk to them, and maybe you can express some of the things that you feel that's going on in your community that would help them to deal with people a little bit different. You can invite them into your church on Sunday mornings if the chief says it's okay. They can come in instead of writing summonses to everybody's car, it's double park. I mean, I don't know if they have that in Hempstead, but they used to have that in the city. So the double park cars, instead of doing that, come in and worship with us for a couple of minutes. Come in and bow your knee. So that's what I'm talking about, sensitivity for things.
Yeah, we don't have double parking in Hempstead that much. Okay. But I know in Brooklyn there's a lot of double parking. Does anybody have any last words about how we can move forward? I'm always, it's good to talk about challenges or problems we have, but I'm always interested in determining or suggesting ways forward, because I believe that if we talk, we can always move forward to a better solution. Anybody?
I think consistency is one of the things of having these conversations and also having those behaviors spread outside of forums such as this. I think that we want this false sense of it to be comfortable. These aren't comfortable conversations, nor should they be expected to be comfortable. And the way that you get comfortable is by consistency. You have those up. So, and it shouldn't always happen when negative things are going on. Like when we feel things are progressing and changing, it kind of should be more attention brought on it to how do we maintain and get to the next level. So I think that consistency and also having these things outside of just an organized, budgeted forum or things of that nature, and being able to take this false expectation for media outlets to spread the word, it's going to be our duty to do that as a people, as a community, to use our platforms to discuss these things more in length than I'd rather spend more time on the solution than talking about the problem. I'm pretty clear on what the problem is, and we've been clear for a very long time.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I can also recall, once again, Steve, I know you came from that area, so you probably remember this also. I can recall we used to have Harmony Day picnics, different things in the community. So, and you just invited them, they got we brought in the mounted unit, we brought in the emergency service, we brought in the different units in the department and had the kids ride around the horses. And we had, what was the clown that used to be, I forgot the clown, the surf clown, whatever he was. We used to have him come out and take pictures with the kids. And that was something that we did every single year, a couple of times, and it went over very well. And I think those are the type of things that we need. We have more community enactment with the police.
And you said Harmony picnics?
We used to call it a Harmony Day picnic. You remember that, Chief? You were the one over there at 115. You remember that?
I can't say that I do. I've seen some. I've seen some stuff that's been done recently, particularly in Brooklyn. I know a couple of the chiefs there, and they're doing a lot of stuff. And they have done some picnics and different things to get the community together. But when I was there, I don't remember the Harmony picnic stuff.
Sounds like a good idea, though.
I don't know who the borough commander was with you. I know that. Like I said, some of the things happened. Chief Banks was the chief of the department, and a couple of little things going on. Anyway, I think that's good stuff. That when you have more interaction that you have, like you said, someone said earlier, because I can recall that as being a police officer, and I can remember kids that would get out of line. And I had to really put their parents in check because they would tell the cop, "Oh, if you don't behave yourself, I'm gonna get that cop on you." And that's not cool because that's why people turn off by cops now. Because a lot of people do that quite frequently. If you don't do that, I'm gonna have to turn the cop on you. So we become the disciplinarian, we become the bad guy. So
Yeah.
I think
That's a good point.
So changing the narrative about how police are viewed by community. I agree with that. Anything else, gentlemen?
I would just say, I would like to see the movement of, if there's a protest, it's about an interaction with law enforcement, just be wary of people that are manipulating that situation for their own purposes.
Yes.
Because if something happens, there's no reason to be boarding up Macy's and Herald Square for something that happened, in Brooklyn or Minnesota, and that's being manipulated. That's manipulative of other people with their motives, and you're seeing that a lot. And and I just need, protests. If it's focused on, know what you're protesting for, but don't just follow somebody who's causing havoc, and that's not what productive at all.
Thank you. Well, my suggestion would be agreeing to disagree, because there are points that we have and positions that we hold that we don't always agree on. And it's okay that we don't agree, but what we have to do is respect one another. Understand that we all have a role to play in our community. The church has a role to play. The civic organization has a role to play. The community member has a role to play, and law enforcement has a role to play. Respect goes a long way. Well, I want to thank all of you gentlemen for sharing your thoughts, for spending this moment in talking about how we can bridge the gap between police and community. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.